Hi all again. Um, so I want to start by talking about some logistics of the class. So the survey that I put on the blackboard seems to be not working. The blackboard is failing me over and over again. So I will see what I'll do with that. But for now, don't worry. Also, just a reminder, in this YouTube channel there are other videos that belong to another class of mine, but you can understand which videos to watch by looking at their names. But I will be sending you emails each time I upload a video for your class, so you shouldn't be worrying about confusing them. Also, yeah, about discussion groups, try to reach the people in your discussion groups. If you cannot, just let me know and we'll see what we do. I'm sorry that we are continuing the class through different platforms like discussion groups on Blackboard, on YouTube, but there will be times that we will be just doing discussions, there will be times that we will be just doing YouTube, but I am paying special attention not to do this an extra burden on you. I will revise the syllabus, I will reduce the assignments. So I just want you to do as much as you can. I know that many of you, including me, we're dealing with other things in life. I mean, we always do, but in this case, it's kind of hectic. So I understand, but I also want you to, the reason why I formed the discussion groups, because I don't want us to be completely isolated, you know? So that's kind of a way that you can contact your classmates. And yeah, I mean, try your best. And for Thursday, we won't have any reading for Thursday. And we will have a video to discuss. So if your group hasn't responded to the questions in the discussion board, go ahead and respond to those questions until next week. And yeah, I will send you a video for Thursday and I will talk a little bit about that, and then you can comment in YouTube again. What else? Oh, midterm. So midterm, I don't think we will do it next week. I'm sorry that I'm just keep changing my mind, but I'm still trying to put things in order. And I think it's too soon to have a midterm right after everything has changed. Um, I will see what I'll do because I'm planning to reduce the number of the assignments. That's why I'm not gonna do it next week. But this week I will come up with a revised syllabus. So this week things will be more, how to say it, grounded. Yeah, they will be more grounded. Okay, let's begin. So I want to begin with some very good comments on the previous lecture. So, for example, Shifa is saying, she's saying that it's really not okay and also interesting that people are talking about Islamic culture as if it's a unified thing, entity throughout all geographies of Middle East. So she's pointing out that Afghanistan has a different version of living Islam or living their culture than other places in the Middle East. But we have an understanding that religion and culture are the same things and they are lived in a very similar or even the same manner in the countries of Middle East, which is not the correct assumption. It's just the assumption that people tend to have in the West, but that assumption drives from the fact that people are being ethnocentric, as we've been telling from the beginning of the class. But Gabby is also asking a really interesting question because we've been talking about the gender inequality in the West. For example, we are talking about the advertising culture, objectification of woman body, in these norms or advertising of beauty and related products, but also we've been discussing how gender inequality plays out in Bedouin society through patriarchy. I mean, both are patriarchy, but how it plays out in Bedouin society in different ways, in polygyny marriage, or women need to comply with the modesty code, whereas men need to comply with the honor code, and men are regarded as more respectful, as more with worth, with more worth morally. Yeah, but Gabby's saying, isn't there any underlying experience, like unifying experience, that unites women? Because they are both, the women in the US and women in the East, despite the fact that they are faced with different forms of gender inequality, they are oppressed by men. Yeah, so isn't there any unifying experience or any unifying point that maybe women can get together in those different places and find a solution to the gender inequality, right? I think it's a very good question. Um, One thing to have in mind, as in the Lorber's article, Judith Lorber is mentioning that gender, the systems of inequality, gender is one, race is another, ethnicity is another, and those systems always work interrelatedly. So if we will see that how race and gender come together and there's a double burden on black women, for example. So it is true that women in the West and women in the East, they are both subject to gender inequality, but also we always have to ask what are the differences. But feminists around the world, they are trying to see if we can come up with a political project that can include all women and at the same time respect and bear in mind that women from different places experience gender inequality in very different ways. Yeah, I think that's the point that I wanted to make. And Rihanna is asking, like, if so Ablugot is saying and thinking what Ablugot says, as many of you commented on the lecture, Ablugot is saying basically that West is creating a single story about Muslim women. Yeah? So Rihanna is saying, is there any reference or point, is there any point that reference to reality of these women? This single story, does that include any level of reality, or it's just a fiction, or it's just a cultural construct that the US creates about Muslim women? I think that's a very good question, and I think this question kind of makes us to think that it's very important to begin with women's experience in any kind of statement that we make about Muslim women. Yeah, we just need to start with their experience and their ways of seeing their own conditions rather than our assumptions. Yeah, so these were the points that I wanted to make, and now we can go on with Judith Lorber's texts. So, as I was asking you in the questions on discussion board, what is gender and how is it different than sex? So, sex and gender, they're usually, or there's a tendency to think them as if they are um, the same thing, or as if gender follows the sex. So if you are biologically female, then it means that you will be a woman. And Lorber rightfully is saying that this is not the case. Sex just refers to difference in genitals, and sex category becomes a gender status through naming, dress, and use of other gender markers. So sex is the biological category, but gender is the social construct. So gender is the way that we culturally reproduce and act in accordance with the two opposed gender roles, namely man and woman, in our society. Yeah. Um, and gender is not the fixed, it's not a stabilized category, but it's also always fluid and it's always in construction. What does that mean? That means that we consciously or unconsciously do gender in our lives. Yeah, so it's learned, practiced, and internalized. It's not biological or innate. You identify yourself as a woman or a man from when you're born through infinite cultural practices and interactions. And we do gender without even thinking. So in the article, there was an example in the very first page saying, like, oh, even if we think that mm, gender inequality is not the same as it was before, but when we hop on in a subway and we see a father taking really good care of their children, we're like, oh, it's so nice of him to take care of his children, right? So, but if it was a woman, we wouldn't be paying special attention to women's care towards their children, because it's like, oh, it's women's job already, she's not doing an extra thing. But when it's a man taking care of the household, taking care of the children, we have a tendency to think that, oh, it's so nice of him. So even this tendency to think that man is doing an extra nice thing by taking care of the household, for example, shows that gender is something very embedded and rooted in our ways of thinking. Yeah. Or she was giving the example of the way that we unconsciously try to guess babies' genders through their clothings. Yeah. Or the small earrings that the babies wear. It's everywhere, and we are not aware of it all the time in a very conscious manner, but it's very rooted in our behaviors and ways of thinking. And importantly, so she's saying that even when the categories blur, even when we say that, oh, we're overcoming gender inequality, for example, women can be soldiers too. So she was referring to this strange rule that the female soldiers need to wear skirts in certain occasions. So we see that when the categories or when gender inequality is about to overcome, there is another practice that kind of um, again divides the gender into two opposed categories. Yeah. So, for example, women can be soldiers. Okay, but this doesn't mean that they have become like men. Women can be soldiers, and women act or need to act or wear womanly to express how they're different than the male soldiers. Yeah, even if gender categories change and blur in some cases, we still have a clear, distinct differentiation between man and woman. And yeah, this differentiation is a very strong part of our culture. Not only our culture, but in the world general. Yeah. Gender shapes our feeling, relations, skill, the way we see ourselves and the world. We learn gender in family, at school, at work, in the subway, and etc. By performing these norms, we constantly reproduce gender. So, gender is a process. Today, gender roles seem to be blurring. Women and men have equal status and work in same places. Does this mean that men and women are equal? Why? So we've been talking about this actually. We've been talking about this. We watched a video, for example, about the labels that we associate with men and women in the same situation. For example, I remember that there was a situation that a man is speaking to the crowd in a very confident way, and the label was a leader. And a woman speaking to a crowd in a very confident way, and she gets labeled as bossy. Or we can see that we were talking about that women and men are getting paid differently, even if they're doing the same job. So even if there is a tendency that gender roles seem to be blurring, um, we see that still gender inequality exists in different ways. Also, we've been talking about how women are becoming have become objects, sexual objects for male gaze. If you remember the video that we watched, Killing Us Softly, in that women's bodies were becoming objects for advertising and for male's gaze. Also, that was kind of forcing women to align themselves with certain kinds of ideals and norms, norms of beauty, right? So this also shows that there is a burden on women's sexuality, whereas there is not a burden on men's sexuality. Um, yeah, there was one more thing I wanted to say. Okay, so this gender inequality, it's not created through random individual practices. So it's a system of subordination. It's called patriarchy. And it's defined and it's imposed through social institutions, through religion, law, science, politics. So, and it's interrelated with race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic conditions that create hierarchies and system of inequalities among people. Yeah. So this is a system of inequality. It's not um, a random thing that individuals do. So in the reading, they were talking about transvestites and transsexuals. So transsexuals are the people who have changed their biologically changed their sex, but transvestites are the people who wear or who act the way that the opposite gender does. And those categories show that the gender is not stable and it does not refer to an origin, which means that if you were biologically born as a male, it doesn't follow that you will become a man, but you become a man or you can become a woman through cultural practices. And in the reading, there was also saying that in some societies, gender is not does not consist of two opposed categories, but transsexuals or transvestites are also a different gender category. But in our society, it is not so. Yeah, because in our society, even if there are transsexuals and transvestites, they are still considered outside of the norm. So in our society, we have two normative gender categories, women and men. Yet in others, this is not the case. Yeah, and I think Audrey's video, I always find it fascinating because, see, when I'm talking about Audrey, I have a tendency to talk about like say she or he, but I mean the gender pronoun that we use is they when the people claim to be not conforming with one gender category. That is why in one of my sections, I think, in my um, in the in the second one, in my 11 o'clock class, I have asked in the beginning, what is the gender pronoun that you prefer to use? Yeah, that's why, because Audrey is saying people tend to second guess, and people, even even when they have good intentions, I don't want to confirm. Audrey, see, Audrey is saying that I don't want to confirm to any of gender categories, but also Audrey is making the point that it's very difficult for us not to second guess, or it's the gender is very much rooted in our minds and practices and behaviors. Yeah. And the political economy of street harassment. I really like this reading too. So, Miceala de Leonardo, she is saying us, she begins saying us two things. So, she's saying that lately there's an increase in street harassment. And if we were in class, I would ask you, I would ask the woman in class who has lived through street harassment. And my experience in my previous classes that every woman did. So this has become a part of our lives in a way. I mean, I sometimes find myself running to my apartment when it's too late not to get harassed or not to get into any further trouble. So, and this shows, this is one of the other ways that we can see how gender inequality continues in the West. So the first way, or one of the first way that we saw was how women become objects instead of subjects of their own, and the case of street harassment actually shows that women have become objects, because Miceala is also saying that street harassment involves a kind of objectification of women. And she's saying, as I said, there's an increase in street harassments, and feminists also do not take it into account, strangely. She's saying that we we tend to not talk about street harassment when we talk about gender inequality. And she's saying in the very first page, I mean the page 51, she says, why don't we see the importance of street harassment? I believe that is because we don't want to admit our own impotence. We don't admit how badly street harassment damages all of us because there is nothing we can do about it in the short run. Self-defense classes can't stop stares, words, and gestures. The idea of arresting harassers is laughable. We try to ignore harassers, we attack them verbally, or we reason with them. There are few stories of triumph. Street harassment is a nearly fail-safe crime, like hit-and-run murder without the telltale car and where the police aren't interested anyway. So, I think this explains very well is that it's so subtle, street harassment, right? It doesn't have to be always physically in the form of a physical harassment. It can also be a gaze. It can also be a way of talking, and there is not much you can do about it. Yeah, because you cannot go to the police and say like, oh, that man was gazing me in the subway, in a harassing way. Yeah, and the police will say, which man? Or there is not a institutionalized law against harassment, but it's very much part of our lives, and it's become a emotional burden in women's life. Yeah. So, and she says that this also, the fact that it's becoming an emotional burden in women's life, also is in line with the way women are stereotypically seen as more emotional, more obedient, nice, and because harassment is also calls women to do an emotion work. So at the end of the page 52, in the second column, she says each incident of harassment forces a woman to do what Hochschild calls emotion work. That process of forcing one's emotion to correspond to what is expected. A harassed woman works on herself. If she wants to believe that he is just being friendly, she batters down her fear, smiles, and says hello, trying to ignore his degrading micro-interactional signals. If she practices the strategy of ignoring the harasser, she stiffens all over and tells herself that she isn't upset. If she chooses to fight back, she pumps up her adrenaline and prepares to act against an entire lifetime socialization, not to make a scene, then leaves the interaction feeling like a survivor of a car wreck. I have practiced each of these kinds of emotion work on myself. Yeah. So, and the way, so she has two main arguments about why the street harassment has increased. It's because she's saying the women have gained a visibility. Yeah. So there is this ongoing trend on women working more and more and making part of public life more and more. Yeah. So that is also why what we called, oh, the gender inequality is, we are starting to overcome gender inequality as more women is working, as more women have a say in different realms of life. Yeah. But she's saying, the author is saying, we can understand that the gender inequality still continues by the very fact that men feel impotent, feel threatened in the face of these changes. Yeah? Men feel threatened because women are becoming more and more visible in public sphere, so that the harassments are increasing. Yeah? Because they still want to be powerful in the public sphere, so that they don't let women alone, or they kind of show their power in the form of these harassments. Okay, I think in a nutshell this is the points I want to make. I have a slide about um, Lorber's piece, Judith Lorber's piece. So I'm gonna send that to you and put it on the blackboard. And yeah, if you have reflection papers, just send it to me. Yeah, I think this is all. I'm also gonna send you the video that we're gonna watch for Thursday, and I'm looking forward for your comments.